Hello friends, now we will discuss important concept related to the research design. A good research design is often used in flexible manner. It is appropriate, it is efficient, it is economical and so on. So generally the design which minimize the bias and maximize the reliability of the data collected and analyzed is considered a good design. So the design which given the smallest experiments error is supposed to be the best design in many investigations, and a research design appropriate the particular research problem usually involve the considerations of the following factors: the meaning of obtaining information and the availability and skill of the researcher and his staff, the objective of the problems to be studied, the nature of the problem to be studied, the availability of the time and the money of the research work. If the research study happens to be an exploratory or a formulative one, so wherein the major emphasis is on discovery of the idea, insight, the research design is most appropriate must be flexible enough to permit the considerations of many different aspects. But when the purpose of the study is accurate descriptions of a situation or of an association between the variables, accuracy become a major considerations, and research design which minimize the bias and maximize the reliability of the evidence collected is considered a good design. So here we use some important factors related to the research design. So first is the dependent and independent variable, a concept which can be taken on different quantitative values is called the variable. As such, the concept like weight, height, income are the example of the variable, and quantitative or attributes are also quantified on the basis of the presence or absence of the concerning attributes. So, but all the variables are not continuous. The variable in form of the quantitative difference value, even the decimal points, are called the continuous variable. But all the variables are not continuous if they are not only be expressed in integer values. They are the non-continuous variables, or in statistical language we can say these are the discrete variables. As in the example of the continuous variable, but the numbers of the children in the example of the non-continuous variable. If one variable depends upon or its consequence of the other variable, it is termed as a dependence variable, and the variable that is antecedent to the dependence variable, its terms as independent variables. So for instance, if we say the height depend upon age, then height is the dependent variable and age is the independent variable. Extraneous variable, independent variables that are not related to the purpose of the study. There is no useful in the study. There is no use in the study. So, but many affects the dependence variable are terms and extraneous variables. Suppose the researcher want to test the hypothesis that there is the relationship between children's gains in social studies achievements and self concepts. So in this case, self concept is an independent variable and the social studies achievement is the dependent variable. So Intelligence may as well affect the social study achievement, but since it is not related to the purpose of the study undertaken by the researcher, it will be termed as the extraneous variable. So when effect is noticed on the dependent variable as the result of the extraneous variables, is technically described as the experimental error. And a study must always be designed that the effort upon the dependent variable is attributed entirely to the independent variable and not to the some extraneous variables or the variables. So next term is the control. So one important characteristics of the control design is to minimize the influence of effect of the extraneous variable, and the technical term control is used when we design the study and minimize the effort of extraneous independent variables. And the experimental research, the term control is used to refer the restraint experimental condition. Confounded relationship, that is the next important term used into the research method, using into the research design. Confounded relationship, when the dependent variable is not free from the influence of the extraneous variable. So the relationship between the dependent and independent variable is said to be confounded by the extraneous variable. So next one is research hypothesis. When a predictions or hypothesis relationship is to be tested by a scientific method, it is termed as the research hypothesis. And the research hypothesis is the predictive statement that related an independent variable to the dependent variable. And usually the research hypothesis must contain at least one independent or one dependence variable. Predictive statements which are not be objective verified, or the relationship that are assumed but not be tested, are not termed research hypothesis. So next one is experimental and non-experimental hypothesis. When the purpose of the research is to be tested, a research hypothesis is termed as the hypothesis testing research, and it can be of the experimental design or of the non-experimental design. Research in which independent variable is manipulated in term experimental hypothesis testing result research, and research in which independent variable is not manipulated is called non-experimental hypothesis testing research. For instance, suppose a researcher want to study whether intelligence affect reading ability for a group of the student, and for this purpose he randomly selected 50 students and test their intelligence and reading ability by calculating the coefficient of correlation between the two sets of the score. So this is an example of non-experimental hypothesis testing research, because here the independent variable intelligence is not manipulated. But now suppose that our researcher randomly select 50 students from a group of the students and who are to take a course of the statistics and divide them into two groups by randomly assign 50 to groups A and usually studies program and 25 to group B, the special studies program. At the end of the course, he administrates a test to each group in order to judge the effectiveness of the training program on the students' performance level. So this is the example of the experimental, because here we perform the experiment. So that's why it is called experimental hypothesis testing results research, because in this case independent variable, the types of the training program is manipulated. So next term is experiment and control groups. In an experiment hypothesis testing research, when a group is exposed to usual condition, it is a term, a control group. But when the group is exposed to some novels or the special condition, it is termed an experimental group. And in the above example, the group A can be called a control group and group B called an experimental group. If both group A and B are exposed to special studies programming, then both group would be termed experimental group. And it is possible to design studies which include only experimental groups or studies which include both experimental and control group. So next one is treatments. The different condition under which experimentals and control groups are put are usually referred to as treatments. In this example, two treatments are usual studies programs and special studies program. Similar, if we want to determine through an experiment the comparative impact of three varieties of fertilizer on the yield of the wheat, and in this case the three varieties of the fertilizer will be treated as the three treatments. Next one is the experiment. The purpose of the examine the truth of the statistical hypothesis related to some research problem is known as the experiment. For example, we can conduct an experiment to examine the usefulness of a certain newly developed drug. So experiment can be of two types: absolute experiment and comparative experiment. If you want to determine the impact of the fertilizer on the yield of the crops in case of absolute experiment, but if you want to determine the impact of one fertilizer as compared to impact of some other fertilizer, then our experiment, then it will be termed as the comparative experiments. So often we undertake the comparative experiments when we talk the design of the experiments. So next one is very important terms, that is the experimental unit. The predetermined plots or blocks where different treatments are used are known as the experimental unit, and such experimental must be selected very carefully. So these are the some basic terms we can use in research design. Thank you.